we wanted to try to step away from, it's almost impossible, but at least to some degree, the large, more politically driven conversation about this, to really think about the ethics of this power asymmetry and the issue of partnership as a fundamental part of partnerships, and invited CAREL IJsselmuiden, who is the executive director at the Council on Health Research and Development, to present this. CAREL is a public health physician, professional, primary care doctor. He was the founding director of the School of Health Systems and Public Health in Pretoria in South Africa in 1999, has been a longtime health activist within Africa, and also within the UN and the WHO context around the world of ethics. And we thought that the example of what has been done, that CAREL's led this process called Research Fairness Initiative, dealing with the capacity to do health research in low and middle income countries, and the partnerships, the health research partnerships that have been pretty well established for many decades, really, in terms of researchers from the north and researchers from the south, has raised some of the kinds of issues that might be illuminating to us in thinking about the private sector partnerships in this development area that we're talking about now. So we've asked CAREL to present the Research Fairness Initiative and try to make some of these connections for us as additional data for the conversation that will follow in the next two panels, where we'll be really drilling down on the bilateral conversations that are going on to move this global health agenda. So, CAREL?
Thanks, Joe, and also thanks for the organizing committee to get me here. I think that the topic of the forum itself, the partnerships in creating sustainable solutions, appeal to me, both the sustainability and the partnership. We'll apply it to sustainable health research systems. So it focuses on health research, or research for health, if you want to be it a bit wider, in low middle income countries. And we think we found a practical and particularly a doable solution to some of this. And that is what I hope to demonstrate this afternoon. Let me first go ahead and set the scene. You probably are aware of this slide. It is the grand challenges. If you go to the Gates Foundation's webpage, it demonstrates, if you want, where the grants are being allocated. And the key issues that change are not so much this pattern of the darker it is, the more grants you get, and the lighter it is, the fewer grants you had. That has remained the same for about 15 years, with a few countries as exception. What does change is the amount of awards and the amount of grants. And so this is the key issue that we are trying to address. So why 15 years later is this pattern not, is the world not getting blacker, so to speak? Why is it that the overwhelming paradigm is still very much, the problem is in the south, the solution is funded and exercised and researched in the north, globally speaking, but also the human capital, the social capital, the business spin-offs, all of that happens in the north and doesn't go to the south. So the benefit of this is products will come to Africa to deal with the drugs or medicines or technologies will come to Africa, and of course that is a great thing. But all the rest of the industry of research, of the industry of science, remains outside the countries where it is actually most needed. And so what can you do about it? A second scene setting is Tim opened or launched this report of the International Vaccine Task Force under the heading of Strengthening Clinical Research Capacity to Prevent Epidemics last month in Geneva. It is mostly Wellcome Trust, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I believe, and the World Bank that focused on this. You can read this text for yourself, but the summary of what the report states is that in order to deal effectively with epidemics in future, you need research capability on the ground. You need to be able to test vaccines, to test drugs, to test technologies quickly in those countries where it is taking place. In order to do that, you can't wait for the epidemic to take place, then build capacity. You have to build capacity in the periods at interim. And in order to do that, the task force believes, if you want, that strengthening the internal country capacity as well as regional capacity to deal with the clinical research related to epidemic control would be crucial. So now we're talking about chronic, sustainable research capability within low, middle-income countries. The one flaw in this argument is that this was made for Ebola. It also applies to NCDs, or maternal child health, or health systems research, or health economics. So in fact, what we're talking about is that there are crises and there are epidemics and there are reasons from a health perspective to make sure that there is a minimal, sustainable health research capability in countries anywhere. And that is just a health perspective. A Ministry of Science and Technology perspective will want the same to be there because of job creation, economic activity, innovation, and becoming a global player, globally competitive. So there are many reasons to think about why to have sustainable capability and capacity in countries. So the partnerships, the research networks, they are everywhere. You've known about them. Everybody uses the word partnerships. There's a great setting in the Nature articles in 2015. You go to the European Union site, and basically all their grants are required to be partnerships. There is the talk about research networks rather than partnerships in themselves. SDG 17, of course, was already mentioned. And if you want the DNDI's latest report, many of the institutions claim that partnerships is their way to progress. But then if you look at what that partnerships mean and what is beyond the scientific production, it means usually some PhDs. It usually means maybe a lab. And that is the end. That is the end of a systematic, if you want, approach to what partnership could achieve. And that is a key problem. Because if we would have been as systematic about understanding what those partnerships should achieve, then maybe in 15 years this map could have been much more homogeneous in color. So in our view, very simplistically, there are two major ways of achieving long-term national health research system, the term we use, sustainably. The one is you get national support, long-term, beyond political boundaries. You do the Singapore, you do the South Korea, you do the Chinas, and over a long period of time, substantial investment in science and technology, of course, is prize number one. And the US is, of course, a great example of that over many, many years. The other is partnerships. Externally funded, externally expertised, externally whatever, to help you build your own capacity. That also applies at the highest level of research, but it also applies for low middle-income countries. But the problems with partnerships is if they are not fair, if they are not well constructed, they actually do very little. So the reality, we think, if I try to, my own amateuristic graphic display, is that we deal with different diseases. One day you do environmental health, the next day you do AIDS, the next day you do something else, because that is where the money comes from. The grants happen. Institutions don't get built because those grants go all over the place. So there is no opportunity to really make all this work count in terms of the national capability of that could surge in future, if you want, for epidemic outbreak or any other disease. And what it should be is more like this. If you could create a framework that over longer periods of time creates a system in which grants help institution building, not just in terms of expertise, but also in terms of financial management, in terms of fundraising, in terms of communication, in terms of a variety of other things. So institution building in countries could happen. And this, as you can see, could be a proxy and a synergy with national funding. And if national funding doesn't happen, which it doesn't happen in many countries, then this is the only way to go. And that is why it's so important to focus on partnerships. So that's how we got here. There are two questions to be decided that we didn't hear very much about. So if the IVTF, the CEPI report that I just showed you, says, well, we need to build a minimum sustainable capacity in countries to do clinical research in terms of epidemics, well, they don't define what that is. There is no definition. Some parts are funded, for sure, we need clinical research capability, but what else? Do you need finance capability? Do we need other capabilities? I wanted to give you the one example on this grid here. As just a simple example, if you start systematically thinking through this grid and say what would constitute all the key issues that in this country in high-income countries we accept as normal. They are there, so you almost don't realize them. But what would need to be in place, for example, in West Africa to deal with this? Well, we found, for example, that if we leave South Africa and by the time we hit the Mediterranean, we found approximately 2 lawyers that would be competent to negotiate confidently with a corporate lawyer on the other side of the table a pharmaceutical contract in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. So that's it. So that's the legal capacity for Africa to deal with IP rights, data ownership, what would be after sharing. So surely that is not fair, but it's also not very efficient. It also doesn't lead to sustainability of systems. So as an example to say that thinking through systematically what could happen can very easily lead to very insightful low-hanging fruits that can be tackled. And I'll give you some others. So the one part is to have a grid to understand what that system is. The second is to think about what are partnerships and what are those partnerships that are fair, where are they, and what needs to happen in order for them to play that role to align, if you want, multiple successive ongoing research into a synergy or even a replacement, if you want, of national funding. And that is where the Research Fairness Initiative comes in, which was designed, if you want, to understand that partnerships are at the core of creating those sustainable research capabilities, that there is no accepted framework. I can show you empty slides of guidelines, articles, even as late of 2014, an article by a Canadian specialist in a high-impact journal with the title on top of it, "We should really give ownership to Southern researchers." I mean, if that is still necessary in 2014, you start wondering what we've learned over so many decades of research collaborations. And so the global framework, we don't know exactly what we mean with partnerships. There is no sharing, there is no criteria, there are very few things that we know about how to do this. So the RFI was designed, wide global consultations, 2 years of work to try and understand what those areas are. And we came up with, we think, a very simple, pragmatic interpretation of the word fair. It deals with issues that happen before the research. It goes from the beginning to the end, what happens during research, what happens after. I can't give you details in 15 minutes, but you can download all those information, but I'll give you an example. So it is a reporting initiative. It is not a report card. It's not an index. It is not an access to medicines index type thing. It is more like a global reporting initiative. It is self-reported by institutions. And even at the very short, you'll see that there is quite some impact. The big difference is, or the big idea is that you document what happens as any stakeholder in research, and you say what you're going to do better in the next 2 years. And that's all. That's essentially it on 15 key topics. It is not difficult to do, but it will have major implications, and I'll show you some. So on those 3, the overview are there. I will give an example in each of those so that you can see how it might work. The first would be, for example, on fairness of opportunity, and one of those indicators deals, of course, then with research financial management capabilities, but also contract negotiation capacity. And the questions are the same. Is that if you go in partnership, do you assess the capability for them to contract or to negotiate a contract? And if you don't, why not? Or if you do, how do you do it so that we can share and learn? And I think there's nothing more, problematic for somebody sitting on this side of the table with somebody sitting on the other side of the table. If the one is a lawyer and the other is not, it's a harrowing experience to get a decent contract, because the suspicions, the arguments, it is in an inefficient way. And so the question could be, what is the standard? What do we need to do about it? So some examples could be that, well, maybe if you are a funder, you could include a part of your budget, let's say $10,000 for your counterpart to hire independent legal advice. Maybe that could become a global best practice that can be shared. When I mentioned that, somebody said, "Oh no, by God, don't get 2 lawyers across, because that becomes a self-serving legal fight." So we don't have the standards, but at least let's start getting what the practices are or what the lacunae are. In terms of fair process, I can tell you a key issue here, for example, is data ownership. We had 3 universities, 3 institutions in Senegal, with the Ministry of Higher Education, Science and Technology, complete a report. And the simple comparison of answers on question 292, as it's called here, material transfer agreement, is that even though one is the prime HIV-2 research center in West Africa, funded as a public-private partnership by Gilead, none of the three had a material transfer agreement. So here we are trying to talk about sustainable research systems in Senegal, and yet everything is done à l'amicable, as they say, because I trust you. There is no ability to create ownership of the very samples that Senegal provides, for example. And so if you want to be sustainability, if you want to build it into your system, a very low-hanging fruit for Senegal, the conclusion for the ministry, is set up a half-day workshop on material transfer agreement, and suddenly you have improved the capability of the whole of Senegal to do that, and presumably of West Africa. From a northern perspective, often the external financial audit is a key issue, and if that becomes part of a normal practice, suddenly there is much less need to talk about, if you want, careful maneuvering how you give the money if there is proper financial audit, and if doing this creates a substantial ongoing business, if you want, for external auditing. And then lastly, if you want fair, technology transfer, sharing IP, there are key difficult issues that are not being addressed, for which there are no answers. And so we're trying to seek for how do we do this. Similarly, the Senegal example, there was no IP capability in the country to actually deal with complex IP agreements. And that is a serious problem if you want to do that. And again, it can be solved a bit less quickly as a material transfer agreement, but nevertheless, you could start thinking about regional and national centers for IP support, for example. And so those could be key benefits that come out of this. The reports are available, in fact, now also in French and German. For a private sector perspective, many of you might be familiar with the Global Reporting Initiative, and that is a key successful in terms of reducing environmental footprint of the private sector, and we model quite a bit on this. There are major impacts. I wanted to just, my last two slides, to show you what is already happening, even though it's early days. So we had really proof of concept development in 15 and 16, and last year trying it out in a few countries, and now it's going open. The first one to report back was WHO TDR. They produced a report, and there was a major assessment that it was for the first time that they set together, after being in existence, I don't know, for 30 years or so, that they have a strategic decision about what they mean with partnerships, and systematic looking at what it is that they were doing when they're speaking about partnerships. That was their response. The Institute of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene of Lisbon just sent in their report and decided that for them a key issue was the benefit to external partners. They felt it very important to show they're out of their colonial history. They are now equal partners in terms of their country. That was a major benefit to them. At an aggregated point, we found external benefits where one of the Senegalese universities has contracts with Switzerland and Canadian universities. Both countries have actually elaborate guidelines on how to do responsible research collaborations, but none of them were referenced in their agreements, and so they didn't know about it. So the RFI helps you to think about those. Another one is that the community of Portuguese-speaking countries has now accepted a recommendation that within the health sector, collaboration between the CPLP community should follow the RFI guidelines. So we will see more reports coming out of the Portuguese-speaking country, and the workshop is currently going on in Mozambique. And lastly, part of the RFI system is to share those experiences and analyze for good practices, potentially development of new standards, and sharing actually out what is happening. So the last slide that you can read while I'm closing off is that currently there are 3 that have reported, 2 that are busy finalizing, 2 major institutions, one University of Cape Town and the other the Institute for Development Research in France, that have now said they are going to start the process of writing the RFI report, and a whole set of institutions that are keen and interested to start working on this. You will see that in this there is very little private sector still. However, in the lead up to the period, we had support in our consultative meetings globally from Pfizer, Celgene, and Sanofi, and I think this will start growing now that it's starting on the road. So with that, I would like to leave the place for some questions.
That's fine. Yeah, we're running late, but we're keeping the time slot that was allocated because all of these things I think are so important to explore. So we have about 5 minutes for questions, and I'm not as good as Tim Evans, but we'll see how we can bring them forward and maybe get a few of them out, because I think this may be an area where we want to hear what questions people want to talk about, and then let Carol sort of wrap up at the end. So yes, you want to tell us who you are and then give us your question.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Michelle Forsley. I'm a global public health lawyer and work in a lot of these countries where there is indeed very little legal capacity. So I wanted to applaud you for highlighting this important issue. And I want to bring to your attention, a few years ago, maybe 10 at the moment, the NIH put out a proposal to create what was essentially a back office service organization for clinical research organizations. And I think if I understand what you're doing correctly, you're creating something like this in a virtual sense and also trying to leverage it at national level. And I wonder if there are other areas besides legal, which of course is extremely important, you could find ways to create what would be the same kinds of activities that get repeated in every single trial. Every single research project has to do certain things. And one simple example is there is no centralized collection of laws relating to what you have to do to set up a clinical trial in a country. There's no place to find them. And even at the national level, when I go in and I'm trying to collect the laws, it is like pulling teeth because they are not digital. They are not, no one has a set of them. Not even the General Counsel, if there is one in the Ministry of Health, has the set of laws that apply to the entire health sector. It's a pathetic situation that at some point we need to address because we cannot function with SDG 16, rule of law, and have effective institutions if we don't have legal infrastructure in place. And I wonder if you, from your capacity in COHRED, can make this message a little louder. Thank you.
I think the really important comments. I think we want to stay clear about this presentation was really not so much to dive into the specifics of the broader research enterprise, but to really see what the analogs might be. And I think you're raising the question of sort of legal frameworks and rule of law. And some of our colleagues probably that are members of the forum would have a sense of that from their own corporate backgrounds and may wish to comment. But do you want to sort of, you said you have some early conversations with private sector, or some of these issues emerging where you could make the connection for us, where you see the opportunities at least in the contracting process, you know, for...
In the contract, yeah, I think what you'll also see if you look at the grid again that I put up earlier, although it looks kind of complex, in effect there are many opportunities. And so one of the areas is that dependent on the competencies and the core areas of where private sector in particular, but also public sector has their specific areas of competence, you can contribute. So in law, for example, in a public environment, actually a project called TRREE for TREE, which tries to outline for different African countries at least the legislation around clinical trials. It is run out of the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. So there is a project at least, but it's certainly not worldwide and not too well known. The other one is across the road, so almost from here. There was an organization not so long ago called PIIPA, which stands for Public Interest Intellectual Property Advisors. That was almost at its heyday a group of 3,500 legal experts who would be giving their time, if you want, fee-free for causes they felt were good. I think it has imploded a bit because of lack of resourcing, but those are the ones that I know of. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. Okay, and then we'll come to you in the back next.
Martin from CDC. I had a quick question too. One of the things working with research institutes in countries we get a lot of questions about as well is the executive management. To your point of having a long-term national vision and support is that executive management. And with private sector, there's a lot of opportunities in terms of month-long trainings and different things that they have access to for this sort of effort in managing research institutes as well. And just wanted to put that on the table as well. Thank you.
Yes, in the back. Just introduce yourself and ask your question. Get some steps in.
My name is Ok Pannenborg. I used to be the Chief Health Advisor and the Technical Health Director at the World Bank. But I'm speaking in my capacity as chairman of the, as you can hear from my accent, I'm from the Netherlands, of the Dutch Government Commission on Global Health Research. And I want to congratulate CAREL with the outline. And while I'm happy with the direction that the conversation is taking in terms of the legal examples, etc., I would like to bring it at least back for the wider discussion a little bit later to the, let's say, the fairness initiative in terms of, to put it bluntly, the power distribution. The Dutch Commission engages not only in Africa but in Asia and elsewhere with many, many research, not projects, but science institutions, universities, etc. And even as, let's say, what we like to think about ourselves in the Netherlands, enlightened research management in the global sense, it's not even close. So there are many, many areas. I like the grid that you presented, but it's not only legal. It's simply very small level, sometimes accounting rules. There happen to be a law somewhere hidden in the international research legal system of the Netherlands that grant allocations by the National Research Council of the Netherlands cannot be transferred to an accounting entity in Africa or Asia. Full stop. Germany has the same. Only until recently the Max Planck Institutes could not transfer money outside a financial institution in Germany, and so on and so forth. So I'm highlighting it because I think it would be, the time is really overdue, and maybe in the National Academy of Medicine or Science in general, NASEM could initiate an effort on this continuing power discrepancy between the rich world and the medium world and the lower world in terms of, sorry, apologies for that.
Hey, thank you. We'll let you answer your phone and we'll let CAREL have the last word because
See,
we're
so,
ready.
but I make my point that there needs to be a much stronger effort to jointly, among those who actually have the power, and that includes the Chinas of these worlds, and Japan and the Brazils, to balance and make it really a joint equal playing field. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it is a very elegant way of getting long speakers by phoning them up. You know,
I have no phone on me.
Okay.
I didn't do it. I would never cut him off anyway.
So the summary of the point that I try to make is that research systems in low middle income countries are essential. Partnerships are a key way of getting there, and a framework to guide them over a long period of time is essential. And the only one currently available is the RFI. And we would hope that this thing can be picked up by all the stakeholders, all the partners, if you want, in this audience, for example,
Yeah, I think
as a key way of supporting science development forward.
I think you put some interesting opportunities on the table as far as sort of really looking at it analytically. What are the elements? What are the capacities that need to be in place to balance the scales, if you will? Yeah. And it's a really interesting opportunity for us to think about it some more. So we thank you very much for raising those issues. And I'll turn it back over to Ambassador Lang to take us into the next panel. Thank you.